I was a custodian at a sleep research facility. This is why I quit custodian. The official definition is a person who has responsibility for taking care of or protecting something. But that wasn't what I had in mind when I applied. I imagined that I would be pushing a mop bucket down vacant nighttime hallways, changing fluorescent bulbs in empty rooms, and performing simple maintenance on disjointed door hinges or leaky faucets. For the most part, that was exactly what the job entailed, but it wasn't all of it. Not by a long there was one clue in the job description. But in my desperation for work, I passed over it without a second thought. Buried in the requirements was a single phrase: capable of working with an unusual schedule and conditions. I figured that they were referring only to the work hours, which were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It wasn't until I arrived for my interview that I gave a thought to what the second part of the phrase might mean. The Cerulean Institute was located at the end of a shady, unmarked lane, about 20 minutes out of town. It was an ugly, bone-white structure perched atop a grassy hill that looked like it must have been murder to mow. I felt suddenly grateful that groundskeeping wasn't one of my responsibilities. Everything was clean, discreet, and obviously dripping with money, but even after I had walked into the lobby, I still wasn't quite sure what the place was for. The receptionist greeted me with a smile, buzzed me through a sleek frosted glass door, and led me into a small office. I was pretty sure that the way her azure outfit matched the furniture was no accident, and I was still wondering whether I was going to be expected to wear some cheesy, badly fitted uniform when a handsome, curly-haired man in a white lab coat knocked on the door. The man introduced himself as Dr. Narcy, and sleep, he told me, was his passion. He couldn't understand how other scientists could devote so much time and energy to studying the ocean depths or the void of space when over a third of our own lives, our sleeping lives, remained a mystery. The best way to study sleep, Dr. Narcy informed me, was through the eyes of those who couldn't leave it. When he saw the confused expression on my face, he just flashed a bright, big-toothed smile and gestured for me to follow. The sight of orderlies in pristine white scrubs and the heavy odor of disinfectant in the air had prepared me for something reminiscent of a hospital, but what I found was far more strange. Not a single patient at the Cerulean Institute was conscious. Everyone was in some sort of coma. Unlike other hospitals, where cries of pain blended with hushed doctor-patient conferences and the conversations of loved ones, this place was deathly calm. There were no intercom announcements, no gallows humor jokes being swapped between nurses. On break, the quiet, Dr. Narcy explained, was important to ensure that no outside variables would interfere with the work that he and his fellow researchers were doing. I, too, would be expected to keep noise to a minimum. Looking out at all of those corpse-like figures hooked up to beeping machines in their anonymous, sterile rooms was the closest I came to backing out. The whole thing was just so damn eerie. At the time, I told myself that I was being foolish, throwing away the only job opportunity I'd found in months just because I'd gotten goosebumps seemed like the stupidest thing I could do. The thought reminded me that Dr. Narcy hadn't asked me any of the typical interview questions or gone over my resume at all when I mentioned it. However, he just snorted. The Cerulean Institute had already thoroughly investigated my past, he assured me. If there had been any doubts about my adequacy, I never would have been allowed through the front door. The only real question now was whether I felt comfortable carrying out my functions in such an environment. There had been problems in the past, he admitted, with employees who had succumbed to their superstitions and quit unexpectedly. I forced a laugh, trying to make it seem as though I hadn't been on the verge of bolting for the door and leaving all of those blank wax museum faces behind me for good. Dr. Narcy didn't look very convinced by my false bravado, but he appeared to appreciate the effort. He placed a large, tanned hand on my shoulder and guided me back to the reception desk to fill out the paperwork. I would have gotten a more accurate understanding of the place, I realized later, if my first visit had been at night. During the day, the patient-to-staff ratio was something like 1 to 5. On the night shift, it was more like 1 to 16. As if that weren't enough, the lighting was reduced to half strength after sunset. About maintaining natural sleep cycles. But I wondered whether the Cerulean Institute might just be trying to skimp on the electric bill. They were running a lot of machines after a land I had no idea what most of them were for. Either way, the combination of dim lighting and vacant spaces made the place a lot more disturbing after dark. There was something else, too. I soon discovered that entire wings would be marked off limits, sometimes for days at a time. Later, they would reopen as though nothing had happened, and another area would be shut down. I received notifications about the closures on the same clunky office software that provided my work tickets, tasks like unstick window shutter, room 204, or clean and disinfect storage area C. It's not like I needed them, though the electronically sealed doors and blacked-out windows made it obvious that I was meant to steer clear. Those odd changes in layout made everything take twice as long and gave me the unsettling sensation that I was wandering through a different facility each night. And just as Dr. Narcy had warned me, there was plenty in the Cerulean Institute to feel queasy about. Asterisk, from a scientific standpoint, I knew that the patients were all alive. but with their consciousness drowned deep in a place where the waking world couldn't reach. There was virtually no chance of any of them sitting up in bed with a wide-mouthed scream or reaching out to grab my wrist with cold, desperate fingers when I passed by. And yet, a very unscientific part of me was certain that at any moment it might happen. Those long tile hallways, with their softly beeping machines and rooms full of silent, waiting bodies, became the new setting for my nightmares. I was the one in the hospital bed, watching some stranger push a mop bucket down the hallway. I wanted to shriek, to reach out to them, to beg them to free me from the prison of my flesh. But I couldn't move even an eyelash. All I could do was listen to their footsteps fade, like my hopes, into the endless dark. The orderlies, however, didn't seem bothered by the place at all. The fear is like seasickness. An orderly named Jamie told me one night when we both caught each other sneaking a cigarette around back by the dumpsters. You either have it or you don't. Me, I sleep like a baby when I get home. They're just lumps of meat, man, you know. Don't let it get to you. Jamie was a big, stubbly bald guy with thick black glasses and a smoking habit that was even worse than mine. He had been at the Cerulean Institute for 3 years longer than anyone, it seemed. Well, there's the Institute, and then there's the Institute. Know what I mean? He told me when I asked what he thought of the place. Take a look at the doctors and nurses, Jamie suggested, and tell me tomorrow night if you've noticed anything different. I wasn't sure what the point of Jamie's game was, but I played along. It was a way to pass the time, and sure enough, I did spot one small anomaly. About a fourth of the staff had small blue key cards hanging from a lanyard, or stuffed into the front pocket of a lab coat. They kept the key cards in places where they could be seen without being conspicuous. A way, I supposed, of identifying one another. If you're gonna ask what that means, Jamie said when I reported back to him, you can save your breath. I've got no idea. He took a long, thoughtful drag of his cigarette. My guess is that there are 2 types of research that go on here. One official, the other a not so official. Am I curious? Sure. But you know what? Right here is an okay gig. The pay's decent. You don't get exposed to bad weather or do much heavy lifting, and the customers never complain. I'm not gonna risk it all just to scratch an itch. It wasn't so easy for me to forget about the closed-down wings and blue badges. They wove themselves seamlessly into the fabric of my nightmares. In my mind, I would find myself staring down the hallway at one of those locked doors. As I sighed and turned to push my cleaning cart, I would realize that the floor had begun to tilt slightly. The door flew open, revealing only blackness on the other side. Then lights began, one by one, to go out. I tried to run away, but I was never fast enough. The incline became steeper and steeper until, instead of running forward, I was falling backwards, swallowed by the polished tile throat of the Cerulean Institute, like some poor sea creature that had slipped between the jaws of an anglerfish. The dreams were getting worse, but I didn't have them every night, and slowly I came around to Jamie's point of view. I could put up with a little sleeplessness if that was what was needed to keep such a low-stress job, even if it was on the graveyard shift. Things might have gone on that way for years if it hadn't been for what happened last Thursday night. I was replacing a leaky pipe in one of the restrooms when a low, mechanical moan, like a tornado siren, began to echo through the facility. It wasn't the fire alarm which I had tested before. This was something else, some other signal whose existence I hadn't been aware of until that moment. I poked my head out into the hallway. Jamie and two other orderlies were already there, looking just as confused as I was. But a thin blonde doctor I'd never seen before and one of the nurses were running as fast as they could. Both were holding blue key cards. The rest of us looked at each other awkwardly. I cleared my throat and asked Jamie if this had ever happened before. Never, he said, and shook his head. I told the little group that I would head to the front desk. Maybe there, I figured, I could find some hint of what was going on. I was so lost in my troubled thoughts that I nearly walked face first into the door at the end of the corridor. I had expected it to open when I pressed the push bar, but it didn't. I tried again, and this time there was no room for doubt. The door was sealed. Whatever that alarm meant, one of its effects had been to put us in lockdown. Only the people with the blue key cards, I realized, were still able to move freely through the institute. I looked around for a sign of what had changed, but found nothing. I couldn't smell smoke or hear any storm. The night outside was black and still. The patients continued to sleep. What had I expected? That they would all suddenly sit up in bed with murder in their eyes when they heard the alarm. The thought made me shudder, but we didn't appear to be in any danger, not yet, at least. Jamie had begun rummaging through every cabinet and drawer he could find. It took me a few minutes to realize what he was doing. He was searching for one of the blue key cards. I set down my tools and went to help. All the staff who had access to the key cards kept them close at all times, so I didn't have much hope, but we had to try something. What else could we do apart from waiting around and listening to that maddening noise? We ransacked the place like spies searching for some hidden documents. But no luck. Whatever secret The blue keycards concealed, it was hidden well. I leaned against the push bar of the locked door and sighed. Then the lights went out. The power outage. If that's what it was, didn't last more than a few disorienting, terrifying seconds. Many of the patients were on life support, and the Cerulean Institute had its own backup generators in case of an incident like this one, nor so Dr. Narcy had told me. The emergency lights, however, were even dimmer than what I was used to, and their color was blood red. Once I had recovered from the initial shock, I realized something. The door I was leaning on was slightly ajar. The circuit must have broken, just long enough for me to push it open. I hesitated, then opened it further. I wasn't sure what I was so afraid of. The hallway on the other side was identical to the one I was standing in. There was no sign of anyone, not even the thin blonde doctor or the blue card-holding orderlies. I took a few tentative steps forward, being sure not to let the door slam shut behind me. I doubted it would lock itself again from the inside, but there was no way to be sure. Halfway down the corridor, the hairs on the back of my neck all stood up at once. I heard door, maybe sensed movement behind me, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty. It was like someone had snuck from one room to another behind my back. But why? The patients were all unconscious, and any other institute employee would have stopped and said something. My throat was dry and my palms were sweating, but I didn't dare go back to investigate. I needed to make it to the front desk and figure out what was going on. I kept checking over my shoulder as I walked, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was there. I had almost reached the end of the hallway when I heard the door behind me, the one that I'd left open, just a crack, slam shut. It's okay. Just keep moving forward, I told myself, then felt that confidence die as I took in the scene around. The corner. The thin blonde doctor lay on the floor, her white lab coat stained with blood. I froze, squinting into the crimson gloom. The nurse was slumped, unmoving, against the wall. The moment I saw him, I knew I wouldn't be able to force myself to keep walking down that gruesome hallway. Instead, I stooped to pick up the blue keycard that the blonde doctor had dropped. Closer up, I could see that her throat had been slashed with some rough instrument, maybe a piece of glass. More shards of it sparkled on the floor. I backed slowly away. I had to warn Jamie and the others, but first, I had to get back alive. What the hell had happened here? Was there some kind of break-in at the institute? And if so, why? The sound of an agonized scream and a scuffle brought me back to reality. It was coming from the rear wing, where I'd left Jamie and the others, just as I'd feared. There was no sign of the other two orderlies but Jamie was there, one hand pressed over a gruesome wound in his neck, the other wrapped around a cut in his belly. He was the one with medical experience, not me, but even I could see that we had to find some way to stop the bleeding. I flung open the wardrobe of the nearest room and grabbed the first thing I found, a bedsheet, then hurried back to him. He was trying to speak, I realized, but his words couldn't make it past his gashed windpipe and the blood burbling down his throat. The alarm overhead blared on. Jamie went pale. His eyes slid out of focus. His knees gave out when I tried to lower him to the floor. It was only then, with the sheet tamping down his wound, that I was able to understand what he was trying to say. Behind you. The bald, barefoot stranger was wearing the same blue hospital gown as the rest of the patients, but she was no sleepwalker. Her eyes were wide with fury and pain. A shard of broken glass gleamed between her bony fingers. I threw up my hands, knowing all along that I was already too late. Then she hesitated. "You're not a doctor." The young woman rasped, asterisk. Her voice was hoarse, her words uncertain, as though she had spoken in years. She was probably in her early 20s, but she already had the pale, atrophied look that most of the Institute's patients seemed to take on eventually. I could see the EEG marks on her head and the 4 hookup in her arm. She must have ripped herself free of it in a hurry. Only some kind of insane desperation could have given her the strength to do what she had done to the others. I pointed to my badge. I'm a custodian. You've got to get me out of here," she gasped. I looked from Jamie, who was bleeding out before my eyes, to the shard of glass in the girl's hand. She had killed my friend, and who knew how many others. But now that she'd lost the element of surprise, I could probably overpower her. Wasn't that the right thing to do? Tackle her before she could hurt anyone else, then call the authorities. Something held me back. "What's your name?" I asked. A blank look crossed her face. She didn't remember. "Call me Eve," she said slowly, and then lowered the shard of glass. "You don't really understand what goes on here, do you, Mr. Custodian?" I realized that she was shivering. I returned to the wardrobe that I had thrown open. There was gauze, disinfectant, and a thicker blanket that I wrapped around her shoulders. Somewhere around the corner, a door burst open. Eve's eyes grew wide with fear. I rushed her to the open wardrobe, helped her inside, and shut the door. I returned to the hallway just in time to see Dr. Narcy and the 2 missing orderlies barreling down the hallway. Both of the orderlies held tasers, but Dr. Narcy was armed with a pistol. "Where is she?" he panted. I asked him what he meant, grateful that the fear and confusion on my face was genuine. One of the patients, Dr. Narcy explained, had woken up and become violent. Such things had happened before. But this time, the nurse on duty had been taken by surprise. She was armed and dangerous, and needed to be apprehended as quickly as possible for everyone's safety, including her own. Dr. Narcy's description of the night's events made perfect sense. So why did it sound like a lie? I hadn't seen anyone, I answered. I had been working on a leaky pipe when I'd heard a ruckus in the hallway. When I'd come out to investigate, I had found Jamie lying half dead against the wall. Dr. Narcy studied my face carefully. I had a nasty feeling that he knew I was hiding something, but there was no time to do anything about it now. His patient was still on the loose. Warning me to stay put, Dr. Narcy and his orderlies advanced toward the locked hallway where the blonde doctor and several others lay dead. As soon as they checked it, I knew that they would be back. After the door slammed behind them. I returned to Eve. She was curled up in the corner of the wardrobe, her improvised weapon at the ready. When she saw that it was me, she lowered the shard of glass and sighed. I fiddled nervously with the blue key card in my hand, my mind racing. Now that I had it, I could go anywhere in the facility. So what was the quickest way out? How could I get Eve to the authorities, the real authorities, without being stopped by anyone who worked for Cerulean? I've got an idea, I told Eve, but you're not gonna like it. The long rectangular cart that I pushed around for work had a little bit of everything. A shelf for cleaning supplies, a shelf for tools, another that held replacements for expendable goods like toilet paper, an enormous black trash bag in back. It was more than large enough for someone of Eve's size to climb into, and fortunately, I hadn't collected any garbage yet that evening. I would have a hard time explaining what I was doing, pushing my cart around during a lockdown. But only if Dr. Narcy had told the remaining staff in the building what was going on, and I had a sneaking suspicion that he hadn't. I can't believe this is happening, Eve muttered from inside the cart's trash receptacle a few minutes later. It's like a bad dream, I offered. Don't you dare say those words like you know what they mean. Eve snarled, suddenly furious. I glanced around nervously. If anyone heard, we were done for. There weren't many people on the graveyard shift, but I should have run into somebody by now. Where was everybody hiding? Crouched down with their heads against the wall, like students in a tornado drill. Or did Dr. Narcy have them all out searching for us as well? That's what they study here, you see. Even whispered. Bad dreams, how to create them, how to control them. You know how certain sound frequencies can affect people's moods, right? Even make them hallucinate. The researchers here are trying to do the same thing. But while you sleep, I doubt that any of the people you're seeing are really in a coma. Like me, they're probably being kept unconscious with drugs, then woken up periodically to check. They're T-rating. Tirade, I asked. Terror rating. They want you to wake up screaming gibberish and frothing at the mouth. They want you to be so scared that you don't even know who you are. That's the goal. But why? I was suddenly skeptical. It all sounded so far-fetched. What if Dr. Narcy was right, and this Eve really was some kind of dangerous escapee? Why would anyone want to do such a thing? Think of the possibilities. Eve snorted in disgust. Imagine you work for a 3-letter agency or some kind of corporate espionage operation, and you need to get someone to talk. Imagine you want to completely wipe their brain or even reprogram them. With the technology that they're building here, you could do it overnight, and everybody's got to sleep eventually. Wait, how did you get here, then? I wondered. Out loud, the last thing I remember, I was in the back of my parents' car, going to the dentist's office to have my wisdom teeth removed. But that was what? 3 years ago now. Those bastards probably told my family that I never woke up from anesthesia. They probably asked them to donate the body to science to make sure the same thing didn't happen to someone else's kid. You don't believe me? Check the medical files. I bet you won't find any car crashes, concussions, or rare diseases. Just blank charts and fake names. People whose doctors sold them to this horrible place for a price. And you've been a part of it. Eve didn't say the words, but I heard them in the aftermath of her explanation, echoing through the crimson hallways, along with the deafening alarm and the squeaking of the cart's right front wheel. It was so loud that I didn't hear the nurse running up behind me until it was too late. "What are you doing?" the young man shouted. "Can't you see we're in lockdown?" I put on my best dumb custodian face and scratched my chin. "I dunno," I replied. "Nobody told me nothing about it. I was just heading up back up front to put my cart away." The nurse rolled his eyes and huffed. "Just stay out of our way, okay?" He stomped off down the hallway without another look back. He hadn't noticed the unusual bulk inside the black trash bag, or how my knuckles were white on the cart's push bar. It had worked. We were almost through. Up ahead were the final 2 doors, the ones that led through the office hallway where I had been interviewed by Dr. Narcy. What felt like forever ago. The offices were all shuttered and dark. None of the administrative staff worked the night shift. Eve shuffled slightly in her hiding place, eager to break free. I shushed her and backed out into the lobby. I had never been tased before, and at first I didn't know what was happening. It was like being punched in the neck by a lightning bolt, and I went down hard. barely aware of Eve's screams as she kicked and struggled. Dr. Narcy and the orderlies had been waiting in the lobby, of course. They were. The tall, narrow windows were too tight to climb through, and even the emergency exits had been sealed. This was the only real way out of the Cerulean Institute, and they must have known that TH escapee would have to pass through it eventually. You should have thought about the security cameras before you lied, Dr. Narcy hissed into my ear, while the orderlies fought to pin my hands behind my back. But it's too late now. I'm going to enjoy putting you through our program. Maybe it was the prospect of being sent into the hell that Eve had just described which gave me the strength to slip free. Then again, maybe it was just the filthy water of the mop bucket that had sloshed onto the floor during the struggle. I slipped through the orderly's arms and flung my weight into the cart, slamming it onto our attackers. A grunt, a curse, and a high-pitched shriek. I couldn't see where Eve was in all the chaos, but it sounded like she'd recovered her shard of sharpened glass. I stumbled to my feet and tried to get my bearings. There was Eve, running toward the front exit to the parking lot. I already knew she wouldn't be able to open it not without the blue keycard around my neck. The second orderly crashed into me, trying for a tackle, but I was still able to slide the cart across the floor to Eve. Stop her, Dr. Narcy yelled. The orderly's hesitation was just the brake I needed to sprint for the wide open door. They hadn't signed up for any of this any more than I had, and like me, they were probably starting to have their doubts about the gun-toting Dr. Narcy's orders. The air outside tasted like nighttime, damp grass, parking lot, asphalt, and freedom. My truck was just ahead. The dew on its windshield sparkled in the glow of the parking lot lights. Eve gripped my hand as we ran. We were going to make it. The shot rang out just as I was reaching for the driver's side door. As soon as I heard it, I knew it wasn't meant for me. Eve's fingers slipped through my own. I only got the briefest look at what the bullet had done to her head, but it was enough to make the vomit rise in my throat. I scrambled into my truck, keeping my head down as I turned the key in the ignition and reversed. But there were no more shots. No one was targeting me. Because there was no need to. Eve was the only first-hand witness, the only one who could have proven what was really going on here. I was a nobody who had worked at the Institute for just a few weeks. No one would believe what I had to say, and even if they did, I was willing to bet that whoever was funding the Cerulean Institute had ways of making the story disappear. They had murdered her to keep her quiet, and there was no doubt that they would do the same thing to me. I drove home, barely aware of what I was doing, and as soon as I was through the front door, I made directly for the shower. I screamed into the torrent of hot water. I needed to let everything go to wash away this horrible night and plan my next move. I thought about the gas cans in the bed of my truck and the fact that, unless someone had changed the locks, I still had access to Cerulean Institute. I could burn this nightmare to the ground once and for all. I slept for 12 hours, and when I woke up, only my injuries convinced me that it hadn't all been some horrible dream. There were no calls from my former employer, nothing to indicate that any of it had happened at all. It made sense from the Cerulean Institute's perspective. The less evidence, the better. I spent all that afternoon steeling myself for what I was about to do. At best, I'd be likely to face prison time. And I had just as many chances of winding up in a shallow grave on that grassy hillside, or plugged into one of Dr. Narcy's nightmare machines. Still, I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I had to act, no matter how horrible the consequences might be. I owed it to Eve. My Maps app showed that there was a golf course on the other side of the woods that ringed the Cerulean Institute. I made my way there an hour before sundown and parked in an out-of-the-way spot that I hoped was close to my destination. I had forgotten how disorienting walking through truly pathless forest could be. Even just moving straight ahead was a challenge. By dusk, however, I had reached the south side of the hill. I squatted down in the undergrowth, watching, but something was wrong. The windows of the Cerulean Institute were dark, and there wasn't a single car in the parking lot. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I threw aside caution and jogged up to the main entrance. The door opened easily to my keycard, but there was no one at the reception desk. The offices, too, were empty. From the strange equipment to the trafficked patients, the entire facility had been gutted. Razing it to the ground now would do nothing but create a minor inconvenience for an insurance company. Dr. Narcy and his backers had moved everything overnight. But their experiment wasn't over in a different place. Under a different name, I know that the Cerulean Institute is still carrying on its twisted research. Maybe right now, some clueless, working stiff like me is pushing his mop bucket down its silent hallways. Maybe right now, someone is going in for routine surgery, unaware that they'll never see their friends and family again, unaware that they're about to spend the rest of their life trapped in an endless nightmare.